Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing simchat le'olam, kol ha'yeladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me. Yeah.
Welcome to the Haftorah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and others. But there's only one prophet so important that there are two books in his name.
And you'd be talking about Samuel, right?
Correct. And for the second week in a row, it's a special Shabbat with a very special, if I might say so, and troubling Haftarah reading from the first book of Samuel.
Well, I certainly agree it's special, this being Shabbat Zachor, or have you forgotten?
Who could forget Shabbat Zachor? But the real question is, what are we supposed to be Zachoring?
You mean remembering, because you've already forgotten to introduce us.
I didn't forget. I just didn't get to it yet. And now I'm ready. I'm Larry Herman, drinking some very fine wine and talking Haftarah with my good chaver, the king of cannellation, Rick Muller. How are you doing, Rick?
Doing fine. Looking forward to Purim coming up next week. I think that's one of the things that Shabbat Zachor is supposed to remind us of. And I just love chanting from the Megillah. I like the special trope and the potential to add a comical element where appropriate.
But Rick, there's nothing at all comical about this week's Haftarah. It's the famous story of how King Saul lost his right to his kingship by failing to fully carry out the instructions of God as related to him by Samuel.
I guess that's worth remembering.
Yes, but that's not why we read the Haftarah on the Shabbat before Purim.
Yeah, I know. The tradition says Agag, king of the Amalekites, was an ancestor of Haman, son of Hamdata, the Agagite. And Amalek and Agag are symbols of the eternal enemies of the Jews.
And to some, more than just symbols. But allow me to briefly summarize the story in our Haftarah and explain why I say that it's a troubling and in some ways a perplexing story. We start with Samuel reminding Saul that God sent Samuel to anoint Saul as king, and that Saul should listen to the voice of the words of God.
Hold it right there. You're talking about verse 1, which only the Sephardim read. We Ashkenazim don't read that verse.
That's right, Rick. And I find it perplexing that we omit that verse. But moving on, Samuel tells Saul that God wants to punish Amalek for what it had done to Israel when the people were leaving Egypt.
Wait a second. That happened about 300 years before the time of Saul. Isn't that kind of a long time to wait to exact punishment?
Indeed. Another perplexing aspect of the story. So as I was saying, Samuel tells Saul to attack Amalek and to utterly destroy everything that belongs to him.
Excuse me, who's the him? I thought Amalek was a them.
Good question. I think you're catching on. So to continue, Samuel makes it clear that Saul is to kill all the men, all the women, all the children, and all the animals belonging to Amalek.
That's horrible. And for something that their ancestor did centuries earlier?
A bit troubling, no? But I continue. Saul assembles an army of more than 200,000 men to attack.
That's one heck of a large army.
It sure is, especially when you consider that they're supposed to be laying in wait in a ravine. Kinda hard to hide such a big army.
Okay, I'm getting the point. You're kind of doubting that we're supposed to be taking this story literally.
I knew that you'd figure it out. So let me jump straight to the most perplexing parts, at least for me. Saul does a really nice thing. He spares the Kenites, who live among the Amalekites. He doesn't want to see innocents harmed.
Good that you mentioned that. The trope tell us that the Kenites are really important. There's a pazer on El Hakeni in verse 6. The rarest trope, save for the most important idea in the Haftorah. So you're right in thinking that sparing the Kenites is a big deal.
All right. But then Saul and his men kill most of the Amalekites and their animals, sparing only the choicest and also sparing Agag, the king. And what's his reward for carrying out this very nasty business of killing women, children, and beasts? He's told that because he failed to carry out God's instructions to the letter, he's to lose his kingship.
I see your point. From his point of view, he's done a good job. Harsh punishment.
But not as harsh as the punishment that Agag faces, as he's chopped to pieces by Samuel without so much as a trial or witnesses testifying against him. Not at all according to Jewish law.
Troubling if you look at it that way too.
And then we get to the Agag-Haman connection. According to tradition, it was Saul's merciful treatment of Agag, permitting him to live an extra night or two, that resulted in his being able to father descendants, who eventually begat the evil Haman some half a millennium later.
That's not actually part of the Haftorah itself.
No, it's not, but it is the reason we read this chapter. All in all, a pretty gruesome and disturbing tale. But Rick, perhaps you can uplift us with some trope drash.
Well, I already told you about the pazer, that for me is the trope highlight of the Haftorah. You'll be happy that there are a ton of Kadmavi Azlaz.
Oh, I'm happy.
And there's quite a few Dargat Tavirs also. But let's talk about them as we go along.
All right, that sounds good. I suggest we divide up the reading as follows. Verses 2 through 9, that's where Samuel gives Saul the command, and Saul carries it out. Then in verses 10 through 23, Samuel berates Saul for not carrying out God's instructions exactly. Verses 24 to 31, Samuel begs for forgiveness. And finally, verses 32 through 34, Samuel puts an end to Agag.
Okay, so it's page 1282, because we're not doing the first verse. And the credits to, oh, you're going to do it at the very end?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so page 1282.
And don't forget the bracha.
Yes, right. Well, were we going to do the trope first? But no. Do the trope after.
You want to talk about the first verses 2 through 9? Go for it.
Just to show what I see. Verse 3, you have the Kadmavi Azla, Lech v'hikita, go and attack. It's the intensity of it, so that the music goes there. And then after verse 6, after the Kenites are saved, it's Suru Radu. It's attack again. From among the withdraw from the Amalek. Anyway, there's the battle there. Suru Radu is not mixing with the Amalekites there, and then verse 9 is when Saul and the troops actually spare Agag. So there's drama there in the beginning of verse 9.
A lot of fireworks here in these verses.
Yes. Okay, so let's go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Ko amar Adonai tzavot pakati et asher asa Amalek liYisrael Asher samlo baderech baloto mimitzrayim ata lech v'kita et Amalek v'acharamtem ekol asher lo v'lo tachmol alav v'hemata meish ad isha Meolel ve'ad yonek, mishohor ve'ad seh, migamal ve'ad chamor. Vayishama Shaul etam, vayifkedem bat laim, 200,000 ragli, Vaseret alafim, et ish Yehuda, Vayavo Shaul, Adir Amalek, Vayarev Banachal, Vayomer Shaul, Elakeni, Lechu, Sururedu, Mitoch Amaleki, Penosivcha imo, Ve'ata Asita Chesed im kol bnei Yisrael, Pa'alotam mimitzrayim, Vayasar keni mitoch Amalek, Vayach Shaul et Amalek, Mechavila bo'ach Ashur, Asher al pnei Mitzrayim, Vayipos et Agag melech Amalek chai, ve'kol ha'am echerim lefi charev, vayachmo Shaul ve'am al Agag, ve'al meitav hatzon, ve'al bakar, ve'al mishnim, ve'al hakarim, ve'al kol hatov, ve'lo avu achrimam, ve'chol hamlacha, nemivza ve'names otah hecherimu.
Very good. You know, Rick, I think I've told you in the past, for me, the Gershayim is like a hesitation because it goes up and down, right? You want to sing a Gershayim for us?
We had one on in verse 6. Ve'ata.
And go back to verse 3 after the Etnachta.
Vehemata.
Right. And that's the command there to kill all the men and all the women and all the children. And it's almost as if there's a hesitation in the command that Samuel is given. He's not so sure that this is a right thing to do. And
I totally agree. Yeah.
In verse 6, where there it is, Saul is talking to the Kenites, and he's saying, because of the good things that you've done, he's also hesitating because he's not so sure whether the command was to kill them as well because they're with the Amalekites. Right.
Yeah, the Surudu is the separating, separate yourselves from the Amalekites.
Right. Very dramatic verse, very dramatic moment. You could write a whole midrash about that.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we have coming up now in the next set of verses 10 through 23?
Yeah, verse 12, you've got Shmuel, you've got Samuel waking up early. Gets the Dargah Tavir on verse 12. So that reminds me of Abraham getting up early when he was supposed to not sacrifice Isaac, and Baboker happened in the morning. So it must have been troubling for him to have to do that. Anyway, verse 13, you have a Baruch Atah L'Adonai, which is kind of rare. David says it. We have that in the morning service, and here this is Saul who gets to say it. It's fairly common trope, but unusual words.
Actually, it's also interesting because at that point in the story, Saul's feeling pretty good. He thinks he's done a good job. His first time he's about to see Samuel, he expects Samuel's going to congratulate him. He has no idea what's coming.
Yeah. And then verse 16, the word stop gets a yativ. Heref, it's a dramatic pause of the action there. And then Diber Adonai gets the Dargah Tavir. What God said, God spoke. So
what the heref is the hold on or hold off?
Yes, it's the word stop is the translation of it.
Yeah, well here Alter says hold off, so a yativ makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. And right, that they chose the music for a reason. But other parts, other highlights you'll hear at the beginning of verse 20 and the beginning of 21. It's got the real high notes of the Kadma V'Azla and the Darga Tavir.
All right. Well, let's go for it. And
10 to 23.
There you go.
Vayhi Dvar Adonai El Shmuel Lemor Nichamti Ki Himlachti Et Shaul Lemelech Ki Shav Me'acharai Ve'et Dvarai Lo Hekim Vayichar Lishmuel Vayizak El Adonai Kol Halayla Vayashkem Shmuel Likrat Shaul Baboker Vayugad Shmuel Lemor Bashaul HaKarmela Vehine Matziv Lo Yad Vayisov Vayavor Vayered HaGilgal. Yeah, he erected it for himself, Saul did. Maybe a little ego there? I don't know. Vayavo Shmuel El Shaul Vayomer Lo Shaul Baruch Atah Ladonai Hakimoti Et Devar Adonai.
See, he thought he fulfilled the words.
Yeah. Vayomer Shmuel Umeh Kol Hatzon Hazeh Be'oznai Ve'kol Habakar Asher Anochi Shomea Vayomer Shaul Me'amaleki Hevi'um Asher Chamal Ha'am Ametav Hatzon V'Habakar Lema'an Zvoach L'Adonai Elohecha Vet Hayoter Hecheramnu Vayomer Shmuel El Shaul Heref Ve'agida Lecha Et Asher Diber Adonai Elai Halayla Vayomer Lo Daber Vayomer Shmuel Halo Im Katon Ata Be'enecha Rosh Shivtei Yisrael Ata Vayim Shachacha Adonai Lemelech Al Yisrael Vayishlachacha Adonai Bedarech Vayomer Lech Be'acharamta. There's a Gershayim again. Et hachataim et Amalek V'nilchamta havo ad kalotam otam V'lama lo shamata V'kol Adonai V'ta'at el hashalal V'ta'as hara b'nei Adonai Vayomer Shaul El Shmuel Asher Shamati B'kol Adonai Va'elech B'derech Asher Shlachani LaAdonai Va'avi Et Agag Melech Amalek V'et Amalek Echeramti Vayikach ha'am me'ashalal tzon uvakar reshit hacherem lizboach l'Adonai Elohecha b'Gilgal. Vayomer Shmuel hachefetz l'Adonai בעולות וזבחים, כשמוע בקול אדוני. הנה שמוע מזבח טוב, להקשיב מחלב אלים, כי חטאת קסם מרי, ואבן וטרפים הפצר. יען מאסת את דבר אדוני, וימאסך ממלך.
So, Rick, you pointed out already that Gershaim in verse 18, and it's on the word that we see all throughout this Haftarah. It's hacharamta. And the cherem, which we know as being a ban, in this context was actually a complete devastation. And it seems to me that in that pasuk, as well as in the earlier pasuk, Samuel is hesitating. He doesn't feel so comfortable about the order that he's given. But later on, when Saul talks about the fact that he actually did devastate or obliterate, he has on verse 21, I think it is, there's simply a etnachta. Where he
on
says,
the cherem there, Reshit HaCherem, yeah,
right.
Very common trope.
He feels very comfortable with what he's done. He thinks he's carried out the will of God.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
if we move on now to verses 24 to 31, which we don't have time to discuss in great detail, but Samuel's actually begging for forgiveness. He can't quite figure out what he's done wrong, but he's asking for forgiveness here.
Yeah, I feel sorry for him. He says forgive in verse 25, and again later on chatati in 30, I've done wrong, but it's too late. It's too late.
It may be too late. Now, I did want to talk just briefly about a completely different translation that Robert Alter has in verse 31. In verse 31, I'm going to read from the translation of the Eitz Chaim, and this is after Saul is begging Samuel and has even torn his coat. And
yeah, the kara gets a intense trope there, tearing.
Okay, but on verse 31 itself, after Saul has asked Samuel to come back with him to help him save some face, it says, so Samuel followed Saul back, and Saul bowed low to the Lord. In other words, Samuel actually acceded to his desire and went back with him. But according to Alter, he says, and Samuel turned back from Saul, and Saul bowed to the Lord. And it's after that that Samuel then, at the very end, tears or cuts Agag to pieces. So according to Alter, Samuel did not accompany Saul when he went to go to try to save some face.
Right, to that, the monument, the altar that he had made there.
Exactly.
Samuel didn't want to go to that place. I could see that.
All right, so should we hear verses 24 to 31?
Yep. Vayomer Shaul el Shmuel chatati, ki avarti et pi Adonai bedvarecha, ki yareti et ha'am va'eshma bekolam. He shouldn't have listened to his troops. Ve'ata sana echatati v'shuv imi v'eshtachave l'Adonai. Vayomer Shmuel el Shaul lo ashuv imach ki ma'asta et dvar Adonai. Vayimascha Adonai miyot melech al Yisrael. Vayisov Shmuel lalechet. Vayachazek bichnaf me'ilo. Vayikara. Vayomer elav Shmuel. Kara Adonai et mamlechut Yisrael. Me'alecha hayom untanach l'reacha hatov mimeka v'gam netzach Yisrael lo yishaker v'lo yinachem ki lo adam hu lehinachem vayomer chatati ata kabdeni na neged ziknei ami v'neged Yisrael v'shuvi mi v'ishtachaveti l'Adonai Elohecha vayashov Shmuel achrei Shaul vayishtachu Shaul l'Adonai.
So there we have those verses where Saul is begging for forgiveness and Samuel is turning his back on him, at least according to the Alter translation. So now we come to the ending, which happens really quickly and quite brutally.
Yes, and I like the trivia, the detail of the commentary on the bottom of 1284, that the words of Agag might not have been Sar, Mar, Hamavet. In the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, there's no Sar word at all, and maybe Mar is what it should be, bitter. And his last words were, surely death is bitter, instead of the way it's translated there. Anyway, there are variations on the text in some places, and then the last drama, Shmuel, the name of Samuel, versus Agag. Samuel is up high with the dargah. Agag is down low with the tavir.
As he cuts him into pieces.
Right. So we go on.
The last three verses.
Vayomer Shmuel hagishu elai et Agag melech Amalek vayelech elav Agag ma'adanot vayomer Agag achen Sar Mar Hamavet vayomer Shmuel kasher shikla nashim charbecha ken tishka minashim imecha vayishasef Shmuel et Agag lifnei Adonai bagilgal vayelech Shmuel haramata v'Shaul Allah el beito. Sorry, ending. Allah el beito kivat Shaul.
All right, that's the end.
I got caught up in the translation of it.
So I don't know what we're supposed to think about this, because like in the Purim story, we've got a picture of devastation caused by Jews against another people. And I think we're supposed to be somewhat uncomfortable with this.
Well, we are.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank especially and show our appreciation to our technical staff, consisting of Norm Gar and his collection of stuffed animals. Norm, keep those jokes coming. And to the rest of you, Shabbat Shalom and Purim Sameach. Chag Purim Sameach. See you next week.